Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography. Today, we're going to continue looking at Russia, and in particular, today we're going to focus on the people and the culture of Russia. So let's look at what we're going to be able to do today. So as far as our learning targets, we're going to be able to identify as well as describe the political and the ethnic challenges of Russia today, especially with that transition from communism. We're also going to be able to identify and describe the daily life, the religions, the celebrations, the food, and of course the rich tradition of sports in Russia. We're also going to be able to identify and describe those cultural traditions, and we're going to even mention some literary traditions in Russia today. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with those challenges, and let's start with the political challenges. So we have discussed already that Russia went through quite an economic and political change, transitioning from communism to capitalism and a republic model. So one of the transitions there politically is the change in the party system. So we went from a one party, which would have been the Communist Party in Russia, to a democratic federal republic, one in which people elect their leaders through direct elections and through a secret ballot. The president, for my U.S. listeners, has more power and in some cases more autonomy than the U.S. president, and in some cases there are more and less checks and balances, which comes out of the creation of the Russian Constitution. We also know that the rule of law now applies to both civilians and politicians, which particularly for politicians has been a challenge, dealing with the change in their authority as well as their power in that system. Ethnically, we can say that about 4 out of every 5 Russians, so about 80%, are of Slavic ancestry and they speak the Russian language. However, that leaves about a quarter of the population, or that remaining 20%, that has over 100 other ethnic minorities within it. And they call Russia home as well. They have very distinct cultures, they have very distinct languages, and so we could certainly say that Russia does have ethnic diversity, even though we can see a clear majority of Slavic people who speak the Russian language. All right, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about the daily life of Russians today. So we do know that urban areas have begun to grow, especially in that transition from the communist regime, and now we're starting to see that they're becoming larger and they're certainly becoming more modern. We're starting to see tall buildings holding hundreds of typical apartments, and in some cases that situation looks like a one-bedroom typically for a family of 4. One thing we know about the families is that there's a rich tradition of grandmothers, or in Russia they're known as babushka, often living at home and helping to take care of children. This is something certainly that will be interesting to see if it changes in Russian culture, but it's still certainly something that we would see today. Leisure time for Russians has a variety of different activities like it does in many places around the world. They spend time in parks, they go to concerts, they go to movies, and the circus also has a very rich tradition within Russian culture. As far as where people are living, we still see urban areas growing, but we're also starting to see growth of those suburbs, particularly in the European portion of Russia, and more specifically around its capital, Moscow. So certainly some changes in where people are living are starting to occur in that transition for Russia. In that tradition too, religion changed a lot. While the Soviet Union had developed a system of communism, one thing that we know is that communism does not allow for official religions. In fact, it forbids religion being practiced in public. And despite that, we understand that the Russian Orthodox branch of Christianity survived. And today that makes up the majority of the religion or religious practices in Russia, about 70% today. We also know that it's out of that tradition that we got the Cyrillic alphabet. And you might remember that from our lessons in Eastern Europe, and that is the alphabet that is used to help write the Slavic language. Saint Cyril was sent to the Balkans, and as a result, he helped to create the Cyrillic language or alphabet to help write so that Slavs could not only write, but they could read in their own language. And he thought that this would be a good transition, especially for spreading the faith. You will also find other religions, certainly within Russia. You will see Muslims, you'll see Roman Catholics, Buddhists, Jews, as well as other Protestant faiths. So certainly there is religious diversity there too, although you will see predominantly, you will see the Russian Orthodox Church. All right, let's get into celebrations, food, and sport, or sports. We know that small families tend to get together, but we also see certainly the celebration of national holidays. New Year's Eve is a big one. Young people tend to decorate a fir tree and exchange gifts, so that might look a lot like, say, the Christmas tradition in other places around the world. May Day also is a day that often celebrates Russian workers. For my U.S. listeners, it's a little bit more like Labor Day, in the idea that we take that time to celebrate the workers that helped to create, in the case of Labor Day, the U.S., in the case of May Day, the Russian economy. As far as food goes, there's a lot of unique dishes in Russia. Borscht, which is a soup that is made from beets, so certainly more of a vegetable-based soup. Excuse me for mispronunciation here. The shiki is a soup that's typically made from cabbage. Piroshki are meat turnovers, and a lot of your main course meals often include a meat, typically fish or poultry, along with boiled potatoes. Certainly caviar also has its history, particularly in Russia with the miles of coastline that it would have in order to harvest those. With sports, certainly hockey, we know that the USSR especially had a long reign in the Olympics when it comes to hockey. Figure skating also tends to be a Russian-dominated sport. Gymnastics in the U.S. and Russia tend to be the two powerhouses that we've seen as of late. Certainly soccer, tennis, camping and hiking and mountain climbing tend to be more the activities that we see Russians also engaging in as well. All right, let's shift gears a little bit to the cultural tradition. So, shaski, these are short stories that are passed down through generations. So they're a great example of oral history and oral tradition in Russian history. Leo Tolstoy wrote a very famous book called War and Peace. And that's certainly a part of that Russian tradition. With some of these Russian names, I do apologize for mispronouncing them. I am trying to do my best, though. Fyodor Dostoevsky, he and his novels explore the Russian life, particularly during the 1800s. So looking at Tsarist Russia in that case. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he often wrote novels describing the harsh realities of communism. So there is a literary tradition of looking at the cost of war, the cost of different systems of leadership and different types of government in that written literary tradition in Russia. St. Petersburg also tends, like we mentioned, to be a cultural center in Russia, and it is sometimes known as the Venice of the North. And you'll see traditions like the ballet certainly come out of Russian tradition and Russian culture. You'll see the Nutcracker, and certainly the Hermitage Museum, also a great example of that culture as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for listening. For my students, please reach out if you have questions that come out of this video. For those of you who aren't my students, I really just appreciate you learning with us. I hope that in some ways I'm helping to promote a little bit more geographic literacy and hoping that we can better understand each other as people. As always, I really encourage you to check out the check-in quiz just to make sure that you are picking up on some of those important ideas. Thank you for listening today. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.